lessons of the lepers. Thought about that this week, and the sermon changed dramatically from the beginning of the week till the end of the week. Many, many things happened during the week that were it kind of changed one's way of looking at life, I guess. Anyway. So what is it, before we think about what we learned, what is it we know about these lepers? Well, we know they were in the region between Samaria and Galilee. So they weren't in Jesus' place, and they weren't in a place where you would necessarily expect there to be Jews or not Jews, or maybe Samaritans. It's just kind of a place in between. It's a place in between. Ever found yourself in a place in between? That's where these guys are. Jesus found them as he entered a village. Did you find that language interesting? He found them. And I think about being found and how those days where I feel found are such blessed days, knowing that somehow in the mucky muck of life, Jesus has found us, finds us. And 10 lepers approach him. Lepers in those days were not necessarily, or probably not, people who had Hansen's disease, or what we know as leprosy. They were people that were deemed ritually unclean and therefore could not enter the temple. So this is kind of an important distinction for us to know. These are people that have been cast out by their community. And they keep their distance. They've been taught to keep their distance. After all, they're lepers. They're unclean. We don't want them around us, the clean ones. So they've been socialized and perhaps even brutalized to keep their distance. And yet they call out to Jesus. Master, have mercy on us. Have we ever called out for mercy? Have others called out to us, asking for our mercy? Have mercy on us. Many times when people in the gospel call out to Jesus and ask for mercy, it's followed by, have mercy on us, a sinner, or have mercy on me, a sinner, or on us, the sinners. That's not. These folk are not sinners. They're just outsiders because the community deemed them so. And Jesus saw them. How many times do we not see someone who may be right in front of us, but he saw them, he noticed them? I think sometimes of people who are on corners with signs asking for monetary help. And I think, how many times do people drive by these individuals and not see them, or choose not to see them? But our example from Jesus, and this isn't one of the lessons because it's not from the lepers, is to see people. And he tells them to show themselves to the priest. Why the priest? Because they've been deemed unclean by the people at the temple, and they can't go to the temple. So how do you get back into the temple? You go to the priest, and you show the priest that you are now clean. We think they had some kind of skin disease, but it wasn't what we would call leprosy. they went, they went. How many of us would do that? Go, no, time out. You didn't touch us, you didn't heal us, you didn't do any of that spitting on the ground and wiping stuff on us. No. They trusted. And they went. And as they went, they were made clean. Wow. There's a little bit of faith. They were made clean. And I had to ponder that a bit and say, what were they made clean from? And the obvious answer is they were made clean from the skin disease they had, right? But I think maybe the embedded answer is they were made clean from the judgment of the people at the temple that didn't let them in. One returned when he realized he was healed. Praising God in a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet. Do we do that? Do you remember when we were kids and we actually could get down on the ground and do that stuff? I remember being a little kid doing that, right? Getting down on the ground to pray, that kind of thing. But how often, now in our older age, do we prostrate ourselves at the feet of Jesus spiritually? Do we go to him? We wrap our arms around his feet and we hug him to ourselves in gratitude and praise. Wow. And the next sentence is, he was a Samaritan. Which doesn't mean a whole hill of beans to us, except we get it because it's been beaten into us now by passage after passage, that a Samaritan is not a Jew. And not only is a Samaritan not a Jew, a Samaritan is a bad, evil foreigner. Why is the Samaritan a bad and evil foreigner? Oh, I think it's just because the Samaritan's a foreigner. Don't we do that sometimes ourselves? Don't we cast dispersion on someone else that we see as not like us? Not like me. And so that equals not good? Really? Really? Isn't one of the problems we have in our country today that people who think differently aren't talking to each other? Maybe if we didn't see ourselves as different, but as people in the same human family, we would have different conversations. Or we would have a conversation. And Jesus asks, were there not 10 made clean? How many see that as judgment? Or is it simply observation? Is it simply calling attention to the fact that 10 were made clean and there isn't judgment in it? Because I'm going to say, well, where are the other 9? Where are the other 9? What's interesting is, what tone of voice does he say that in? Where are the other 9? Where are the other 9? Maybe he says, where are my other 9? It really makes a difference how we choose to hear Jesus speak these words. And we can't see his facial expression, we can't follow his body language, and we can't hear his tone of voice. we have to imagine what he's really asking. But what he goes on to ask is this: was none of them found to return and give praise to God? He wasn't asking for them to return and thank him. He's asking for them to return and give praise to God, from whom all blessings flow, from whom all goodness comes, who gives us the good news. And so he says to the one there at his feet, get up and go on your way. And again, what total voice? Your faith has made you well. So what are the lessons that we learn from this story? I think not just of the leper, because I think when we read the story, it's kind of like when we read the Good Samaritan. We think about the Good Samaritan, and we kind of cast off the other ones and don't focus on them. And I think when we read this story, we do something similar. We focus on the one and forget about the other 9. But Jesus didn't forget about the other 9. Jesus didn't say, you know what? You didn't come back and give praise to God, so zap, you got it back, kids. He doesn't do that. They're still his beloved children. Okay, so there are 10 men suffering from some form of skin disease. Makes them ritually unclean, and they can't participate in service. And because they can't participate, they stand on the periphery of their community as outsiders, probably feeling as maybe we have felt, alone or abandoned or even desperate. And we stand outside our communities for any number of reasons that people judge us. Think about that. So these 10 outsiders, abandoned, alone, and desperate, call out to Jesus to heal them. And Jesus heals them. And so what came to mind to me was the times, and I think maybe I'm not the only one that had these, when I felt, perhaps we felt, you felt, pushed outside of your religious community because somebody else judged you as unfit, for whatever reason, to be there. And I know many people who are LGBTQ folk have had that experience. But I'm thinking of a time that I went to Catholic church with my mother, who was dying at the time. And I only went really because she was dying, not because I wanted to be there. And there was a younger girl who went to communion in front of us. Now, I had not been to a Catholic church in years. But I was old with my sick mom, and so I, without a word, without a question, without a doubt, was given communion. But the young girl in front of me, who probably was 10-ish, the priest insisted that she had not made her first communion and could not have communion. And he refused to give her communion. You want to talk about feeling alone and abandoned? Not outside your community, but in front of them? How many of us have witnessed those kinds of experiences? I want to just grab that little box that he was carrying, take one of those wafers, and give it to that child, because he was in tears. Why do people do that? Why do people judge themselves worthy and judge other people unworthy to receive God's love in the community of faith? I think, one of the things I pondered was, the founding of Faith Family. And when we called out to God, and God really is the person who gave us this church, did we thank God for giving us Faith Family, a place where we could worship, and where anybody who wanted to find sanctuary, who wanted to find healing, who wanted to find community, could worship. So I think that's the first lesson. I have about 17 yet to go, but I'm only going to do 4 more. I think the second lesson is what I said. It's not about one leper, it's about 10. And we can't forget that all 10 were healed, even though not all 10 came back to praise God or to even thank Jesus. And I think the question that I raised as I thought about this, well, who am I in this story? I know I'm not Jesus. So that makes me either one or one of the 9. And it led me to ponder how many times I had been one of the 9. And for whatever reason or circumstance, had something terrific and wonderful and astounding and good happen, and not find time to thank God for that goodness. That's the second lesson. The one who returns is a Samaritan, the outsider, the foreigner, the despised. Carolyn Lewis asks this question: are we content to respond to Jesus' mercy in only certain ways? Or do we see the outsider, the other, as someone who might model the breadth of our responses to God's love? Have we ever looked at the outsider, the one different from us, the other, and said, you know what? I have something to learn from you in the way you respond to God's love. Something I didn't know because I let Spirit open me to you. I think the fourth lesson is this: the lepers keep their distance from the town, the community, and the temple. Because the community there, the community in the temple and in the town, whether out of fear or simply out of judgment, has made it clear that the lepers are not welcome. And I think we have to ask ourselves, are there times when we keep others at arm's length, whether out of fear or out of judgment? We keep others at arm's length and not allow them to come near, and not even believe they can be healed by God's love for them? Do we get so angry at those who think and act so differently than we do, that we believe they're all demonized and should go the way of all demons? Yeah, I know I've done that. Last lesson. David Luce says of this passage, 10 were healed. 10, no doubt, were surprised. Perhaps some were overjoyed. Perhaps some celebrated. Perhaps others ran off to tell their family and friends. Perhaps a few even took it for granted. But only one felt thankful and decided to express his gratitude to Jesus and to God. Reverend Luce then adds, giving voice to gratitude is a choice with consequences. For as we express our gratitude, we affect those around us. Do you believe that? We affect those around us. And he says, and even shape the reality in which we live. Change the culture in which we live and find ourselves and work and worship and do whatever. Because others have to be affected, perhaps even infected, by the love and the gratitude we have for God because of God's love for us. Now I know there are a lot more lessons, but what strikes me most about this passage is that Jesus meets the lepers where they are. He doesn't judge them. He questions. He observes they didn't come back. He questions why. But he doesn't judge and he doesn't condemn. He heals them. And what I think isn't written here is even though he goes on his way, he waits for them to return, even though they don't in these few verses. I think the question for me becomes, do we trust that Jesus does the same for us? That Jesus meets us where we are, heals us when we have a need to be healed, and waits for us to come and praise and to express gratitude. I think he does.